Hi everyone. I'd like to start off by thanking IYAP for this opportunity. And the topic that I'd like to address today is community building. Now, I have personally always been a great believer of connection, people with common interests, goals, shared ideas, aspirations. So, what is a community? Community can mean different things. It can be a specific geographical area. It can be a group that shares a common interest. It can also mean people who share specific religious or ideological standpoints. Community can mean many things, but we often, and I think this is what I'd like to stress on, that we often underestimate the power that communities have, and why we shouldn't undervalue the power of communities. My interest in communities has grown significantly over the years, and I'd like to take this time to share a few small examples of how community and building communities have worked really positively. So I'd like to start off with some personal experiences, which is through the work that I've been involved in, and I'd also like to share experiences of other people that I know who've also been a part of building communities and how communities have grown and strengthened and been far more resilient as a result of these exchanges. So, to start off with a personal example, my first example is that I live in close proximity to the zoo, which was where the last explosion of the Easter attacks took place. Lives were lost, property was damaged, and to be really honest, everyone in our neighborhood was very shaken. But before long, our small community of neighbors began find ways to connect. Um, Everyone was kind of taking on a responsibility to cook or to support. There was one particular neighbor whose kitchen had been damaged, making it impossible for her to take care of the family. So basically, they couldn't cook. So every day, each family in the neighborhood took turns. So some made breakfast, some made lunch, and mind you, these are also we are very Vehival, as you may know, is a very ethnically diverse geographical area also. So we're all from different communities, different ethnicities, and here we were exchanging breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And this continued for over a month. But in day 10, which is basically 10 days after the Easter attacks, something that I personally think was very important happened. And that is that we put together a small interreligious blessing for the neighbors. So we had a priest from the Catholic Church, we had uh, uh, a Sami from the Kovil, we had a monk from the temple, and we had a Maulavi. And what was really interesting about this very small gathering of 50 of us is that that day we grieved collectively. Up until then, we'd been grieving in our own spaces, in our own homes, with our own anxieties, our own concerns, our own fears that stemmed from our own ethnicities. So everyone had a sense of fear, everyone was grieving. So we all grieved, we all cried, and for me, it was very transformative. And it helped assure our little ethnically diverse community that despite the madness in the world, that we were there for each other in our actions and in our hearts. And that is the first example that I wanted to share with you. This then rolled into a bigger thought on community. How do we then continue to bring people together? If I mean, this is one day, one moment in time that we gathered, but then how do we then continuously bring people together over and over again? And this was something that I was very moved by, and I wanted to be able to connect. And I realized that there was this perfect opportunity with together with some more neighbors. We revived the Vehival Residents Association. Again, it's a very small group that had already been existing, but they weren't as functional for a while. And so we got together, where a group of well-meaning, like-minded people who had the interest of community at heart. So we wanted to be able to do things that brought together the community. And the power of community is not limited to just mobilizing groups, but also in how it better allows you to position yourself when you're dealing with others. And this is one of the biggest learnings that I have about the strength in building communities, is that we were no longer lobbying for anything as an individual. I was no longer lobbying for, garbage collection, or for, for sound pollution as an individual. Instead, we were doing things collectively. And the fact that we were doing things collectively really helped us also gain a certain sense of legitimacy, especially when dealing with things like municipal councils. And we were following in the footsteps of another group, and I want to talk about them as well. Our sister association, which is the Mount Lavinia Residents Association. And they're a group of very enthusiastic neighbors who primarily came together to call out unauthorized high-rise buildings that were mushrooming all over the Mount Lavinia area, alongside the beach, alongside the coastal line. And this was a huge problem for them. And as residents who've been there for many, many, many years, each of them were initially lobbying on their own. They came together, and their efforts as the MLRA has even led now to a court case against the UDA, which is presently still happening. And the reason I want to talk about this is in the importance of us understanding the powers of mobilizing communities, the power of bringing people together. And what's interesting about both these groups, us and our sister group, is that we were, for the better part, just ordinary citizens. The committee comprises of very ordinary citizens who come from different kinds of walks of life, different jobs. They do different things with their lives, but they pool together their resources, and what we've done is crowdfund everything. And what's happened is that we've gone from trying to approach our concerns as individuals to building a community that has the potential to change things, that has a clout to push things. My third example is again one that's personal, and it's my third example is of women's voice in politics. It's also called Deshapalne Kanta Handle. It's a very small platform at the moment that we started a few months ago. And it's a platform that looks at connecting women from different parties, different political parties, and different places on the political spectrum. So they can be council members, they can be someone who's interested in policy, they can be lawyers, they can be just women who are interested in the political space, to come together to discuss politics in a non-competitive space. Because essentially, every time women come together, it's always very competitive, because they're brought together either by the media or by a different group of people who kind of convene that space for them to come together to discuss, their policies versus somebody else's policies, or what their thoughts are against somebody else's thoughts. But here, what we wanted to create was a non-competitive space. So essentially, it's also building communities. We want to be able to share knowledge, to share resources, to share conversations. And sometimes we do this in what I find to be most interesting, and I think we've discussed this even in our groups, is how community building doesn't necessarily have to happen in the very structured way of seated in a circle or seated in an theater style audience where we have these interactions and you go away and you assume the community is built. Community building happens in the smallest ways. It happens in the cafeteria after your meeting as you share a glass of juice or a cup of tea. It happens over small conversations. It happens in a ride back home that somebody will offer another person. That's how we build communities. We build communities through connecting people. And that's something we are hoping to grow, a community of women in the political space who are able to shape their own voices, but moreover, to go back to their own spaces and influence politics. And that for me is how I define power, through communities, how we can define power. Now, communities come in all shapes and sizes. Growing up, I saw my mother take the lead in our neighborhood association, possibly one of the oldest and active associations. And then I saw my grandmother take the lead very recently in her 80s in her building management committee. But these are also communities, and I think that's what we really need to understand, how these are all communities. And something that we talk of when we talk of communities is allowing communities to also build resilience. So one of the, I guess, one of the most interesting examples of that happened in something that I was a part of quite recently. So recently I was involved in perhaps one of the most amazing experiences of what community meant for me by my definition. In a response to COVID-19, I was a part of a collective effort with Sarvodaya and We Build Colombo Together, which essentially is a platform that supports, that looks at development and urbanization, but redefines it, and looks at reshaping it. So I was a part of this effort, this collective effort, and what we were trying to do was support daily wage workers and low-income families with food supplies and basically essentials in Colombo. And so we had a particular area, which was Colombo 1 to 15. And the most powerful thing for us was being able to work via a group called the CDC. Now, the CDCs are Community Development Council. There are, it's basically the Community Development Council, that's what it stands for. And they're essentially a society. It's a very old system that was introduced in the 1980s. And each CDC basically represents a very specific geographical area. And it generally is in an underserved area with many issues. So I'm sure many of you may already know that there are lots of Batu. They call them Batu in Colombo. And there are over 100 CDCs in Colombo. So in our efforts, in the goods that we gave, basically we detached ourselves from giving it directly. We handed over the goods to the CDC, who in turn shared it with their community. And this allowed for many things to happen. So one of the things that happened was that we were able to obviously strengthen these communities through their community leaders. So as opposed to creating a different kind of power dynamic, which I've also spoken about a lot in other webinars and other spaces. So I won't talk about it lengthily, but we were able to go into these spaces, not as our not ourselves. I mean, we did go just to hand over the goods, but we weren't the ones handing it over to the communities. It was people within their own communities sharing it. So it was a very different dynamic. The power dynamic was different because we weren't handing it over. It was shared amongst the community. And we also encouraged, what this did was give the community leaders a little bit of strength to also then take on a little bit more leadership. So what we did was we encouraged them to continuously find solutions to the problems within their communities. And what happened was they were trying to find solutions to things like medicine for their communities, for their Vatta, for their particular geographical area. They were trying to find solutions to all the various problems. So they automatically became a leader within their community. And last week, through the CDCs, we were also able to support Vesak lanterns, makers of Vesak lanterns, basically the vendors, to sell their goods as we tied up with Pick Me for delivery. So these are all examples that I wanted to point out in how we can resolve problems, in how building communities is essentially not just about I think for the longest time, every time we talk about building communities, at the back of our heads, mine included, we always thought of building communities as being like a very NGO style conversation, and not realizing that we ourselves can build communities, and communities can be very small things. I mean, I myself am a part of moms groups online that have really supported my own journey in motherhood. Little neighborhood communities that support us, whenever we need to get something done. Even during this COVID time, a very small group, a WhatsApp group, but it's a very small community of us who make sure that we have each other's backs and we're trying to purchase goods. So if one person can't find something, then somebody else will try to find it. But it really shows resilience, how as individuals, if we can't find solutions to what we want, how through building communities, we can find solutions if we come together, if we pool in our resources. The idea of collective impact is something that I've recently heard through the work that I've done at WBCT, which is also bringing in different stakeholders to come onto one platform and then to try to resolve a problem. Again, pooling in your resources. So communities can be extremely powerful things. And it gives you strength. It gives you, sometimes it depends on what kind of community, but it gives you legitimacy. It gives you support. And this is not something that we need to, we need to be fearful of. I think in most villages, there are various committees. I think sometimes perhaps in urban areas, we are a little more detached from the idea of committees, because you have in a regular space, you have a welfare committee, you'll have an elders committee, you'll have a Kulangana Samitiya, Maranadar Samitiya. But how many of those then happen and are active within our spaces, in urban spaces? How many of us use those ideas of community? So in my talk, that's what I just wanted to touch on. That communities can be very powerful, and building it sometimes can take a lot of effort. Sometimes have very little things, but ensuring that when people connect, when people are able to share their aspirations or their ideas together, there's really a way that you can elevate what you're already doing. In all the meetings that we do, we've also always taken some time to sit back and then to discuss everything that we've learned. And our ideas have grown. Our ideas on community, ideas on how we liaise with, outside parties, our ideas on how we care for each other, basic ground rules on what's right or wrong. A lot of things we learn from these ideas of creating these spaces. So I just want to share that idea with you, that communities, building and strengthening spaces can be extremely powerful, and to not underestimate that power. So thank you very much for listening to my talk today, and I hope you find it useful. And if you do have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me via Facebook and ask me for any kind of clarification. But thank you very much once again.